Hey, Mr. Lamb, how you doing? This print is better, but see,
have a quorum, very unfortunate, but we hopefully will have everybody here soon and be able to make, hey, oh, okay. We're gonna do a quick pause because Nick Neptune just walked in. I don't know if the friendly people at RTN are already filming this. We didn't have a quorum yet, so I was providing explanation there. Okay.
Now you do.
So we are going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And Paul, do you want to start with introductions?
Sure. I'm Paul Neville, and I'm on the Outreach Committee.
I'm Liz Hester. I guess I'm on the Outreach Committee.
Dwight Otwell on the Bicycle Planning Committee.
Mary Syme, the chair.
Robert Parrish, I'm on the Pedestrian Subcommittee.
Nick Neptune, Outreach Committee.
Eric Lamb, city staff.
Paul Black, City Staff.
Fontaine Burris, city staff.
Awesome. And do we have any public comment tonight? Oh, whoops, my bad. Jumping ahead, trying to get us out of here. Can we approve the minutes from the previous meeting? Looking at you, Paul.
I'll move that we approve the minutes.
Second.
Yeah, I just meant because you're always so good at that. Awesome. So, we good there? Yes. And public comment?
You need to vote.
Sorry, guys. I'm really trying to bust along. So we had a first and a second, so I just say, good?
Ask for a vote.
Sorry. Can I vote? Help me out.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, and I don't have to do the gavel. Sorry. I need like a Cliff Notes version or like being a chair for dummies.
Take your time. Take a deep
We
breath.
got it.
Okay, Jonathan Stern.
Take your time.
Thank you for my coaching.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Powell. I live at 1201 Trillium Circle, Apartment B, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27606. And I'm here on behalf of Oaks and Spokes. So first, I just wanted to give an update on the fact that we did Cranksgiving this past Sunday, where we rode out and collected food and toiletries for people in need in the Raleigh community. We gathered over 2,600 pounds of food and necessary supplies, so that went really well. Thanks everybody that could come out. I also just wanted to reiterate our support for a protected and connected network downtown. It's really important to be able to give people a safe way to get around the downtown area on a bicycle and feel comfortable that they're not in traffic. There are also two specific points that I would like to mention that are, I think we could put up like a bike lane in sign or something on Lake Boone Trail going down the hill and on Blue Ridge coming up to Western. Both of those are points where the bike lane ends, either going around a corner or down a hill, so you can't really see it's going to end, and it's a high-speed road. I think some sort of indication to let people know that that's the case would be great. And then also for the citric cycles, I've been loving them. One thing that I think would be great would be a sticker on them that tells you how to release the secondary lock. Paul Black has seen me try and unlock it when I didn't know what I was doing, and I failed miserably several times. And then as soon as it was explained to me, I could do it immediately. It's pretty unintuitive. You have to lift up and then out. You lift up, it like tells it the lock to drop, and then you can pull it out. I think I've seen the posters at like the temporary stations that gave the directions, and it made it clear. So if we could just do something like that as a sticker right next to it, I think that would be really helpful. And then thank y'all.
Thank you. Okay. Staff reports?
Good evening. A couple things to report on this evening. First, just nothing much on the council front. Just FYI, the new city council will be taking, they'll be inaugurated next week, and not next week, the first week of December, and then the first Tuesday in December will be the new council taking their seat. There's only one council meeting in December, and then they'll get started in earnest in January 2020. Fontaine, updates on bike share?
So we just completed the site work for the Dix Park Station.
Could you speak up a little?
Sorry. We just completed the site work for the Dorothea Dix Park location. That was completed last week. We anticipate installing the station in a week. We have to let the concrete cure before we can place the station down. We also received our last set of permits for Pullen Park, so that's the last station that needs to be completed, and we can hopefully begin that work later this week or beginning of next week.
You had mentioned previously, I think, to us that not all the, because of some changes in inspection with making sure that they're plugged into do we have any updates on that?
I believe 15 have been completed, and they're just
Okay.
working through getting those connected to the grid.
So 15 out of 30 are now connected? That's great, okay.
Personal thank you for corrections of the installation at the farmer's market. The 2 rows of bike stations were so close together that you couldn't put the tires of ones opposing each
Gotcha.
other and locked it. Just needed to move them back a couple inches. Within a 2 days of reporting that, it got fixed, so thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah,
That was a shout out to our operations team for quickly responding to that. Core Logistics did a great job in fixing that.
If you're not aware, our master vendor for the program is Bewegan Technology, and they're out of Montreal. They have a local group on the ground here called Core Logistics that's responsible for the day-to-day operations, handling the rebalancing of bikes and handling all the maintenance associated with the bikes. And they have been extremely helpful during the installation process and helping out with some of these things as they've come up. So we've been very happy with them.
I do also just want to share, I don't think I shared it during our last meeting, we have already surpassed our estimated number of rides for the year in the first 7 months, so we're excited to have hit that benchmark. We've also surpassed our estimated rides per bike. The business plan anticipated 0.3 rides per bike per day. We are currently averaging 0.7 rides per bike per day.
Be nice
So
to get to that
double
7
what-
rides per bike per day, maybe someday.
Yeah, and just for comparison, for history, we conducted the original feasibility work for the bike share program in 2014 and developed the projections for what we thought we would be doing in terms of business over a 5-year period and we're in year 1 right now with the start. Not only have we exceeded our projections for how we would be operating in year 1 with 300 bikes, we're exceeding the projections for how we'd be operating in year 5 with 500 bikes. So
When can we get more bikes?
that's phase 2. So that's once we complete the process of installation, we have a series of steps we'll go through with NCDOT, since we're using about $1.6 million in federal CMAQ,
Right.
congestion mitigation and air quality funding was the majority of the funds that we utilized for the installation of the system. And so there's an accounting process we have to go through to close that out. Once we complete that process, we'll be then looking to our next step for implementation of phase 2. Now with phase 2, we don't anticipate using any type of federal funds. What we are talking about right now is actually a lot of public-private partnerships. We've been approached by a number of developers that are interested in having citric cycle stations located adjacent to or within their developments. And so that will likely be our next phase of rollout.
Okay.
And just to add, in terms of numbers, we actually have now surpassed the number of rides that Charlotte's Recycle system hit in their first year.
That what? Sorry.
That Charlotte B-Cycle,
Oh,
they had,
Not that we're competitive, but
they had 30,800 rides in their first year. We are currently at 31,000.
okay.
That
So
included the DNC, right? They rolled out that in time for DNC to meet.
They did, but
Charlotte.
they were forced to pull the bikes out during that. Ironically, they completed the installation, and then for security measures, the Secret Service required the entire system be removed from downtown.
Wonderful.
Operation, it's fine. Okay, well, I didn't know if that was further skewing their numbers. We'll leave them alone.
I'd love to get an update sometime in the future on phase 2 and the public-private partnership aspect and how the city plans on rolling out their own portions of investments, if y'all will be doing a few stations per year, or what that would look like, so that the public can understand and get excited about that as well.
Very good. Thank
Cool.
And then I'm happy to provide any updates on any of the projects. Things should start winding down soon, given the nature of the season. Typically, during the winter months, we have limitations on paving. We do have some activity right now with the Blunt Person corridor. I know the crews were out there today taking advantage of the warmer temperatures to get some of that final paving work down north of Edenton Street. So we anticipate that being done shortly, and the final paving, final marking going in associated with that project. But things will slow down on the construction front for other projects during the winter time.
Right.
Any questions about any of the projects?
Can you remind us when Gorman Street's going to happen again?
It's supposed to start in the spring.
Okay. And in order to maintain the federal funds, it needs to be implemented by a certain date, or does the engineering just need to be completed, or?
Actually, it was just, we had to get the construction authorization before the rescission, and that's happened.
Okay, so now it's back to, I mean, do we have a clear date for
In fact,
when
do
the
you know if
construction will
that's been
occur?
let?
I'm not sure.
But I know that even if it's let, the construction's not going to start until the temperature's
Sure,
going back
of
up.
course.
So we're looking at spring. We're still on track to be open by the end of the summer or early fall
Okay,
next year.
so we're anticipating construction in the spring.
Correct.
Okay. Cool. Chair's report. I was able to join the, well, first I was able to go to the Bike Walk NC conference this month. And that was great. And there were some staff members there, and that was an opportunity to learn some more. Susan Hatchell was also present. I think she was the only other commissioner that was there. So that was a great opportunity to learn more about what's happening throughout the state. I also attended the pedestrian subcommittee via phone call and got to listen in on some of the great work that's happening there. So some really fruitful discussions that Elizabeth can provide an overview. I know community outreach met. I unfortunately was unable to attend that one. And additionally, I attended the bicycle planning committee, and Dwight will provide an update on that. Bicycle planning committee?
All right, I'm up. So we met on, this would have been October 21st. And the first order of business was Mark Holland from the planning department and the bicycle update, the bicycle parking update. So I believe this was TC 1D-18. It might have gone before the planning commission by now and is supposed to go to city council soon. Current policy calls for one bike rack for every 5,000 square feet of field space. And this works well for everything except like Capital City. What's the name of the soccer fields? The
Giant soccer park.
The giant soccer, the Castle Soccer Park, where
Lots of field space.
they would have to have 400 bicycle spaces to make this policy work. So they wanted a revised policy. The subcommittee looked at it and thought it looks great. Their new policy is the new proposal is for one rack per field and one rack per court, with a minimum of 4 bicycle capacity for any installation. And
I think 4 racks, so 8 bikes.
4 racks. Okay,
I think that's
Okay,
what-
so a rack is considered 2 parking spaces,
okay.
front and back.
I think it was 4 racks, so 8 bikes,
Okay.
but
Excellent. Well, good. I was wrong. That's even better. So, but we voted to approve this policy, or we voted to endorse this policy from the Bicycle Planning Committee. So I would like to move that the BPAC endorse this text change.
Second.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. So
We also had a
I'm
couple
sorry.
other things. Just one other thing. Let me check my notes here. We talked about bicycle count and pedestrian counts, and we gave feedback on feedback on different ways of presenting the data from the different counters spread across the city. And tonight we will receive a expanded presentation on that from staff. All right, now I'm done.
I'm just going to say, I don't believe we have somebody who's currently the lead chair with the Community Outreach Committee. So that's something we can finesse over the next month to determine if anybody would like that leadership role. But in the meantime, how should we go about for reporting for that meeting?
You can ask for a volunteer from the committee.
Can we have a volunteer from the committee? I think Paul and Nick were both present.
I'm happy to volunteer.
Go, man.
It's happened so fast. Well, I'm happy to share that the outreach committee got together on the 18th of November at 6 o'clock at Transfer Company within the Work Hall. And, we had Paul Neville and Fontaine Burris on behalf of staff there representing the city. And it was, obviously it was given the few of us, we were able to kind of keep it nice and tight to get back home to our families. But it was a productive conversation insofar as, well, first of all, October was Walktober. So, the outreach committee, had a lot to certainly celebrate there. But I think we're obviously looking ahead, given the transition that's occurring with the sort of, I guess, leadership for the outreach crew. And so, that's something we discuss as far as reaffirming our sort of outreach work plan, which I think is publicly available for anybody who wants to kind of read through the 3 or 4 items there. And then, of course, we ended by suggesting and seeking to hear recommendations from those that were present and anybody else who would like to join the outreach committee. Recommendations as it relates to, based on the work plan, what sort of activities should we really jump into as we head into 2020? Obviously, December is a holiday month, and so we don't anticipate doing much more than spending time with families and at holiday parties, and then whatever little time is left over from that, we'll go to work, I guess. But
bah humbug.
So either way, we're excited. Quite frankly, we are very excited as an outreach committee about 2020 and taking on a robust agenda. So
Looking
buckle
forward to
up,
it.
everybody.
All right. Sounds great. We're excited to hear from that. And Elizabeth, for pedestrian?
Okay, we met last Thursday, and I'm not going to give much detail because I know that some of our items are on the agenda for tonight, but Paul gave us an overview of the implementation status of the 2012 pedestrian plan. We talked a little bit about how projects got on that list. We talked about the microgap projects, and we also talked briefly about what I'm going to get the name wrong, but I'm going to call the Parks Microgap project, which is an effort from the Parks Department to do the kind of like last, I'll say max quarter mile, probably last 100 feet that might connect from a public right-of-way into a park. You'll notice if you go to a lot of our parks that they're very car-oriented in terms of their approach. So looking at ways to get people safely from public sidewalks into the parks facilities, and the opportunity that gives us to use some kind of creative low-cost implementation strategies and try them out outside of the public right-of-way and see if they work, see if there's room for improvement, and hopefully use that as a pilot for rights-of-way in the future. So specifically thinking about flexi-post delineators and making pedestrian paths without having to like pour curb and gutter and sidewalk and all of that. So, but I think you'll be fascinated by what Paul has to tell us and the hard work they have been doing.
Great.
I have something to add as an addendum to her report. Well, we discussed that the Wake Federation of the Blind was interested in having a safety walk in this area to test the safety of crossing some of the nearby streets as relates to audible signals being installed. And we're wanting to move that to the springtime so that we can have enough time to get city officials involved. I mean, these guys really want to expand this. And, I mean, they love the idea. They believe in audible signals. Or we kind of think that every place that needs one ought to have one. But I understand funding and all that. So we're going to work on contacting people, get a date probably in March or April to do this event.
Okay. And do you anticipate that you would need staff support for that, or how are you?
Oh yeah,
How would y'all liaise?
we would love for staff to come, and they're wanting to involve. I mean, I was thinking of a local chapter of the blind, maybe, but they want to expand it to several more organizations of the blind to possibly send a representative at least, or to come and get, contact city officials, heck, the mayor, So,
Write your senator.
yeah.
Well, they don't
So
really
we'll
make
see how it
decisions
works
about
out.
municipal
Office right near
sidewalks, but, okay, awesome. Well, wonderful. Can you keep us updated on how we can support that?
I will.
Okay, wonderful.
And my guys will ask me how you doing, so.
And so the pedestrian subcommittee will be kind of helping to coordinate on that
Oh,
I think
well,
we
yeah.
can, but I think it might be a nice collaborative
with
Yeah.
outreach.
with outreach.
Yeah, I
Right.
was thinking that too. Yeah, because outreach committee had discussed doing some walking audits, so this could be a way to go with a targeted population of folks.
I got this one guy coming on my board. He's a lawyer and he's gonna hold my feet to the fire on
All
this,
right.
I'm sure.
Look for all those liability concerns, huh? Okay.
Well, yeah, probably.
All right, keep moving along to the Paul Black Show. Paul, please
Go,
come
Paul.
down for chapter 1 of 4 on bicycle pedestrian count program.
Can we get this screen on in front of us? Is that possible?
Oh, goodness. Okay, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I'll wait a minute to see if we can cue it up. Is it working?
Yes.
All right. So, good evening. I'm going to breeze through. There's a lot of stuff on here, but I'll go as quickly as I can. And if there's any questions, just stop me. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the bike and ped count program. I think Mary came last month while I was out. So, this is my penance for not being here last week or last month. And I was having fun taking pictures of bicycle infrastructure overseas. Everyone else is taking pictures of old buildings and castles, and I'm taking pictures of paint on the ground. But I've got some great stuff that I may bring to something informal at some point if anybody's interested. But in terms of what's here tonight, this is a follow-up on what you saw last month with the actual counts. This is more about the count program, sort of how do we want to deploy this in the future? Where do we need counts? What are we trying to get out of a count program? And I'm not looking for a vote, but just rather than Paul thought of something and we're going to move forward, I want to say all the brain trust here is going to give us a better product than if I just think of something. So I'm looking for some mechanisms to try and steer what we want to do. So you've seen the prototype reports, and we do call for something larger in the bike plan. We currently have 17 locations in the city. Some of these are parks and recreation. The others were installed by the regional organization, Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. The Campo counters are on street for the most part and will revert to us at some point in the future. We do have some money in the budget to deploy additional counters. So I know you can kind of take a minute and take this in. We are pretty well endowed sort of around NC State campus, and it looks pretty good going up sort of out toward Crabtree. But you can see south and southeast Raleigh and east Raleigh, there's not a lot. We also haven't had a lot of infrastructure out there yet. Talking with Parks and Recreation, their interest in the Neuse River Trail has been where they have a lot of user volume. It's sort of their thing is they want to know where they're starting to approach capacity and might need to be making investment. That's part of what we want to know, but we also want to know just sort of what does the general network look like. And so they may not get counters down there in the future. That's one of the things that we might talk about is, are we interested in putting some of our infrastructure on Parks and Rec facilities if Parks and Rec doesn't have an interest? Those are the kinds of bigger questions we're looking for. So short term, we do have a little bit of money in the budget. I've worked with our repaving folks, and it sounds like they can pretty easily and cheaply integrate some counters as part of the repaving. So just as we kind of opportunistically have gone out and tried to do bike facilities, we can go ahead and let them know up front that we might want to put a counter on some of these. And I've been working with them to identify at least 2 sites where we can do that, maybe 3. And it'll be a matter of space. So we can identify where it's a good fit for the program and for the network, but then we also have to find actual locations where they can be put in. And a great example of some that we've done, if you've ever ridden on Rocky Branch coming out of Boylan Heights where you come off of Cabarrus and you get onto the pedestrian-only section up toward the prison and the light to go over to Dorothea Dix, there actually is a counter just on the backside of the bollards under the railroad bridge. If you've never noticed it, it's there. There's a little wooden post, and there's a couple of little diagonal or diamond-shaped loops in the pavement. There's another one as you go further up in Dix Park. That's a Parks and Rec counter on the same Greenway facility. We've got some on road. There's one on Hillsborough Street in front of the YMCA, Eric. Is that correct? In that general vicinity. And it's one of the highest counts on our system on the on-road network. Right now, it's averaging around 400 cars a day. I think you saw that in your last one. And we want to know what makes a successful place to put a counter. It doesn't always mean high counts. Sometimes low counts also tell us things about our network. So looking for that kind of feedback. For the short term, we're looking at moving forward with at least a couple of potential counters with repaving. And we're looking at some of our projects that are coming online as capital projects in the near future as well, and seeing if we can't go ahead and get counters put in as part of that. Longer term, what are the things we're looking for? Well, right now we're at the first bullet. They're easy and cheap to install. We're new at this. We need to sort of not do difficult things right off the bat. But after that, what are the things we want to look at? Key junctions and bridges. We know that at bridges we're going to get higher user counts because that's a choke point and everybody needs to use a bridge. Are there any known commute or high traffic routes on the bicycle side? On the PED side, special event generators, things like concerts at Red Hat. What does that do to the pedestrian counts on those sidewalks, and what does that mean as we start getting actual numbers? And then geographic equity distribution is another. And in the bike committee, what about safety? What about crash locations? Does that have implications for a count program? And that's the kind of feedback that I'm looking for. And you don't have to tell me things tonight. I want to get it in front of you and just sort of let everybody think about it. We'll be developing this program probably over the next couple of months, other than identifying a couple of short-term locations and trying to make that part of the plan get implemented. So longer term, again, do we care about greenway counts? That's one of the things that is kind of a bigger policy question. I have talked with Parks and Rec staff, and they're like, if you're willing to pay for the counter, I don't see why we'd have any problem putting it in. But again, that might be something also that BPAC would want to talk to their counterparts with on the park side before we go any further. Everything else is pretty straightforward. If we put things on NCDOT facilities, it is a bigger lift. We have to deal with encroachment agreements and other things. So if we do it on city streets where we're doing our own repaving, there's some really low-hanging fruit there. We're going to pursue that in the next year. Same thing with some of our capital projects. And then after that, though, we want to have that bigger picture. So are there any comments, any thoughts?
Yeah, how granular is the data you get from the counters? Like how timing-wise, like how?
So it actually goes through a data scrubbing and normalization process at the Institute for Transportation Research Education at NC State. But we're actually looking at, we can look at really granular data down to the hour by day. But we'll always take that with a grain of salt. We had one count on the Walnut Creek Greenway near Lake Johnson that popped up like 28,000 users on a Saturday. Probably what happened is an insect got in the counter, or the moisture got in. So they go and scrub those weird data points out and look at how to normalize it, and we get sort of a sterilized version. But what we're looking for are, where do we have commuter patterns versus recreational patterns? Where do we have special events? And we are able to get into the data and see that. Yeah. We're generally aggregating on a monthly basis by time of day and by day of week.
Paul, how does the counter know the difference between a pedestrian and a bicycle?
Right now, the inductive loops in the pavement count the bikes. So if you have a carbon bike with very little metal, you might not actually set it off. But in general, anything with any amount of metal, even an aluminum bike, will set those off. And then the PED counters are infrared, so they're counting people passing by. If you look at the posts, there's just a little tiny hole in there, and that's actually the infrared piece shoots across and counts. Now, if you're walking side by side, it may only count one person. It's going to see the person closest to the counter. And part of what ITRI does is they go out in the field and take periodic samples to go back and correct for that and say, for every time that happens, we know that we sort of have to have a correction factor of point something, and they will apply that to the numbers before we get it.
Now, this may be more of a technical question, but like I would walk a route probably twice in one day or several times in 1 week. Does it take into account that people walk multiple times in the same area?
The counter doesn't care. You're still a count. You're still generating traffic.
Okay.
I mean, just like for a car, if I go back and forth over the same intersection a couple of times a day, I'm still generating traffic volume, and that matters to the engineers who have to size the road correctly.
Huh.
I wanted to comment and then ask a question. They're very unobtrusive. I like that. In fact, the one you were just talking about in Hillsborough, I rode by it yesterday, and I was like 20 feet past it when I said, I just went by it. So it's very non-obtrusive, and I like that because that hopefully doesn't impact the measuring process. The question I have is that on the map, it looked like a significant number of the counters were actually on the greenways,
Yes.
and yet the Parks and Rec Department is not actively funding this program and only looks at the numbers if you want to share with them. I would hope that we'd have a cooperation between the two departments.
Oh, we do, and I don't know that they're not installing them. It's just in terms of priority, I pointed out that we really don't have many in that part of town, and I asked about some locations on the Neuse River Trail in particular, and they said it wasn't sort of high on their priority list because of the low volumes. I know that anecdotally, a lot of cyclists will actually avoid the high volume areas just because lots of dog walkers, things that are going to slow them down, and so. But we have no data to get anything beyond the anecdotal evidence, and that's where we can look at, I guess, Strava heat maps or some third party to try and see what is going on, and see what we get. But it would be nice to have at least a couple of counters, and so I looked at again the junctions where Neuse River Trail meets Crabtree or Neuse River Trail meets Walnut Creek might be places we'd care about because you're going to be able to get funneled down counts. One other reason that you see counters on the Greenway it's very easy. We know there's things like on Hillsborough Street, are we going to get cars encroaching that will inflate the counts as they come out of the parking spaces? The one that's on Hargett right now, the Sharrows are actually pretty far out in the lane, and if you're following where the Sharrows want the bikes to ride, you're not going to cross the inductive loops. So again, this was the first installation. Campo was the lead, and they sort of they're trying some things out, and now it's up to us to sort of say, are those counters doing what they're supposed to do? Are they capturing the bikes coming down Hargett Street? We don't know yet. That's part of this experience.
It might be nice, I know that we're looking for opportunities to install these when we repave, but I also know when we repave, we restripe. It might be useful to look at ways that we can get pre and post counts for infrastructure improvements, just to kind of measure our success.
Yeah,
be able to ask for more money.
We talked about that in bike committee, and there is the possibility of getting some temporary mobile counters that we could deploy for a couple of months in advance.
Great. I was thinking even places where we see desire lines, we don't have sidewalks, especially if they're like post-mounted counters, we might be able to do counts on places with no infrastructure.
Yep, and the difficulty there is always sighting.
Sure.
Especially if you have a lot of plate glass windows for the ped counters.
Right. Good point.
Does pedestrian safety factor into these counters?
It can. That's why I'm here and asking for direction.
I'm sorry, I did have one other comment. The intersection of Reedy Creek and House Creek at the Greenway Bridge over the Beltline. If you do not have plans for something in that area, I think it would be wise to consider that. Also to do a before and after check as the construction starts on the freeway. That may, I believe, will impact some of the probably the Reedy Creek Trail.
Yeah, so there is a counter now on the Art Museum side.
Okay, thank you.
And just to let you know, there's no anticipation that the pedestrian bridge there is going to have any type of closures associated with the construction project.
Understood, although I think some of the Reedy Creek, the House Creek Trail through Meredith, or is that Reedy Creek through Meredith?
That's Reedy Creek.
Reedy Creek, there's some concerns about the section parallel to 440 there possibly being cut or rerouted during the construction.
There may be some periodic short-term impacts associated with construction, but the DOT is committed to trying to keep that open because they understand the volume involved with that.
Yep. But before and after counts would be helpful to see what the true impact is for bicycle and pedestrian use of that.
Totally. I think in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about how we can form partnerships with other entities like our transit. As we have our BRT corridors go down, we could have abilities to implement some of these. I think they're about $5,000 per counter, right? So it's not super expensive as far as infrastructure if we're doing this, in a way that's very intentional. And along with the Parks and Rec, I think that if we want to look at greenway facilities, I would like us to be looking at the on-road connection point and not the greenway itself, because I think that is, right now it is a Parks and Rec asset. And I think that we should definitely be thinking about collaborative opportunities, but more so I'd like us to be thinking about our on-road portion of that and how that feeds into and can help create more demand or flow on the greenways, et cetera. Other thoughts?
Another thought about future locations. I can't remember if it was the bike plan or the ped plan did some really interesting heat mapping in terms of car ownership and household income, and also looking at crash locations. And as we know, our lists are hundreds of projects long, and our city is changing rapidly. And so if you were to redo those heat maps, they would change, right? Our poverty has shifted, our needs have shifted. And so it might be, and those maps are fairly easy to update if we have the data, or the GIS data. So it might be an opportunity to look for like where we might have shifts. I think we can intuit it, but it might be a good way to prove it. And also parallel to that, knowing how walking and biking patterns can shift based on socioeconomic income and heavily trafficked roads versus not heavily trafficked roads in terms of perception of safety. So some ways to even like, you could even do like counts on 2 parallel routes to kind of test patterns before you do infrastructure improvements. I'm thinking specifically about the BRT corridors there and whether or not there should be parallel routes prioritized or not.
For pedestrian facilities and for the first mile, last mile type of conversation on the parallel.
And I mean, you know, that gets into like, my brain goes into a giant jumble then, because it's like, well, then it's going to impact land use and, you know, poor people are going to have to move. And, you know, so does that change behavior patterns and use patterns and all of that? But yes, I think a lot of first mile, last mile planning around BRT stops needs to be sensitive to, I guess, like the microclimate.
And so that gets back to your question for us, which was some of the things that you could use as far as your prioritization for implementing these going forward.
Exactly, and I think a lot of it's going to be captured in the minutes, but if there's any other ideas, feel free to just email me and let me know. And then once we have something a little more formalized, we'll certainly bring it back to the committee.
Okay. Just a quick note of thanks too. I think it's awesome that we have so much more data. You guys have been really doing some heavy lifting on mapping sidewalks and getting these counts and
right.
It's
really such a big deal to have this, to have data, because we haven't to date. I mean, this is our first batch of tracking, right? Yeah. With this Campo
Permanent count stations. That's
partnership.
right. We've done spot counts in previous locations in the past, but this is our first attempt at really getting a sustained larger
really
data
important.
set. And Paul mentioned ITRI. You know, ITRI is working to be a central repository for that information across North Carolina. And so part of this effort will standardize the data to match what Greensboro and Charlotte and Winston and Wilmington will all be providing. So we'll be able to see our data relative to these other communities as well.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, and there are counters directly adjacent to us that aren't covered here, but Cary has some, Wake Forest has some, Apex has some. I don't know if Nightdale does.
And do we have systematic ways that we're all communicating on that, I guess, via Campo?
Yeah, and ITRI.
Right now.
ITRI.
Well, through ITRI, but Campo had been the initial entity that, so.
Correct, at least for this region.
As far as, I guess, I'm talking about like strategic planning efforts going forward, if we're identifying corridors, if Cary is doing counting and we're doing counting and Nightdale's doing counting, are we all talking about how that feeds into a system for transportation?
I think we're out in the forefront there.
Okay, so that could be, I don't know how that would be facilitated, but.
I know a guy at Cary.
Okay. Yeah, a few, right? Cool. Moving on to pedestrian plan implementation report, Paul.
Oh, I did have one more slide. Yeah, downtown probably will have some, in terms of criteria, downtown might be different. This is that thing I was telling you about on Hargett Street. You can sort of see, there's where the loops are, where it's just colored, and you can see the white stripe. There's actually another Sharrow just off screen that's under a tree on the aerial photography. But if you follow it up, that's where the Sharrows are placed, and you can see, so technically the bikes are probably going to be just outside where the loops are. And so those are the kinds of learning experiences we had with this first round with working with Campo. And I'm gonna try to see if I can't get a camera out there and see, is it a problem? And if it is, how much of a problem is it? So again, it's a learning experience, but I'm itching to have more data. Speaking of which, we also have a brand new crash data as of today that got released from the state. So the next round is in from the previous year. All right, on to the next thing, the 2012 PED plan. And yes, it was updated, but I wanted to go back to the original list to sort of see how are we doing in terms of knocking things out. We've added some projects to the list. Some of them are capital, some of them have just kind of bubbled up organically. But of the original projects that from 2011, when we started the 2012 plan, we've got 18 that are complete and a few more that are very nearly complete. There might be one small piece missing. We've got another 26 to 28 projects that are queued up already that are at least in design, if not further than that, and getting ready to go to construction in some of the cases. And then again, we've got some of those new projects that did not appear in the original plan that have bubbled up for other reasons. So they can be ancillary to other projects. And so you might see where, well, why did project number 166, priority get built? Well, because maybe that was a number 7 priority on roadway, and we went ahead and piggybacked the sidewalk when they were doing the other project. And others are there are things related to other departments that might be priority for them, and we're trying to get that economy of scale and go ahead and get the sidewalks put in at a lower cost with another project. So of the top 20 projects from that original ranking, I don't know how well it translates. I know on the screen you can't really see, but there are projects that are highlighted in green. They are Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard from Peyton to Glenbrook, Clark Ave from Woodburn to Bellwood, Buck Jones, which was an entire streetscape from Jones Franklin all the way to Interstate 40. Raleigh Boulevard from Crabtree to I-440, and Newbern Avenue from Poole to Raleigh Boulevard are all 100%. And then we have a few more that are very, very close. Capitol Boulevard from East Millbrook to Cavalry is 98%. There is a small micro gap near one of the driveways. And there is one other here at 94%. New Hope Church, there's a section near the railroad tracks and one property on the south side that is missing. So we're actually doing pretty well with the priority projects. There are some that are highlighted in blue. Again, you can't see it very well on the screen. Number 1, Green Road from New Hope Church to Green Oak Drive is in process. It was actually ready to go, and it's being bundled with another roadway project on New Hope Church, again, with the effort to save money and get more competitive bids. But this one is moving and should be hopefully under construction within the next, 2 years, maybe 1? I haven't followed New Hope Church as closely, but it's tied to that project.
New Hope Church will be under construction next year.
There you go. So the old number 1 priority will be moving. And then there's another section of Capitol Boulevard from I-440 to Brentwood that's in development right now, and it's looking to be spring 2020 to get started. There's a few others down here, another section of Newbern Avenue, another section of Raleigh Boulevard, Poole Road, which I think we've seen, Rock Quarry Road from Bart Street to Raleigh Boulevard, and then Blue Ridge Road from Western Boulevard to Hillsborough Street. This includes a standalone pedestrian bridge. Is that right? Or is that the southern side? I'm sorry, that's the southern side. It's 70% done, and there's a sidewalk on the west side missing about 2,000 feet worth. And that's one of our engineers' projects. Amy Billings, who came to you a couple months ago with the Carolina Pines, that's one of her projects. So
Where are we gonna pedestrian bridge in one? Sorry.
the pedestrian bridge is actually in design on Blue Ridge Road. It had been a lap project. We had some major cost overruns because of the pedestrian bridge, and we had to pull that project back, and it did not meet the federal rescission deadline. We are resubmitting though.
Over Wade Avenue.
Right.
There'll be a new pedestrian bridge parallel to the
Parallel
existing
to
Wade
the-
Avenue Bridge, and part of some pedestrian improvements we're making in that area.
Yeah, it's still moving forward, so it's coming,
A
but it
little bit
was
of
more
an eye roll
expensive
when
than
we're
we
saying
thought.
that. Oh, Robert's got a friend. So, when we're saying that it's over because of the pedestrian bridge, I think that there's probably the road was probably pretty expensive too.
Yeah, oh, I know, and it's not over. Again, just we had to step back in terms of the budget that we had to work
Understood.
with. And we decided that the pedestrian bridge is really the key, and as long as we can continue to move forward with that piece and make sure that it connects on either end, that's worth pursuing, and that's what the design team is working on right now.
Right.
And then there's some more that are complete or nearly complete. You can, this list, pretty much everything here I've covered. And then there are some additional ones that were outside of the top 20. Again, they were part of ancillary projects to other things. And that's like Jones Franklin from Hillsborough Street to Western Boulevard. This is a little piece of sidewalk that was built in that sort of strange triangle that was created when all the roads were realigned. But there, it was on our plan and it's 100% done. And you can see some of the others there if you want to read through. And I can provide the full list to any of the members that want to see it. But there are 240 some projects, and it's pretty intense.
Can you talk a little bit, I'm looking at this, one of your columns that talks about bond-funded projects. I know that there was like a livability bond a while back. I'm assuming we're all through all of that. Do we have future bond-funded projects in the hopper, or are we running out of money?
So we've done 3 transportation bond issuances since 2011. The one you're referring to is in 2011. That was a $40 million, kind of a minor bond package, and some of those projects are still in process.
And that was interesting because it was like a citywide, all the little projects were smushed together instead of it being like associated with widenings, right?
Right. Cool. That's exactly right. And then in 2013, we did a $75 million bond. And then most recently in 2017, we did a $206 million bond. And from that bond specifically, we had a very substantial allocation for sidewalks of all different types of shapes and forms. Major capital construction, safe routes to schools, small area plan implementation. So we have set aside more money in the last few years, last 3 years for sidewalk construction than we had in the last 20 combined.
Great.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why in that list we have such a big number of almost 30 projects that are going to be done by 2023. That's the net effect of all those bond monies being spent.
And so the next bond will have another glut.
Yeah, and so a lot of those projects in the 2017 bond, those are the ones that you're seeing come before you and they're getting ready to go.
Right.
Because
So that would be, it's like a 6 years, which seems like pretty standard. Like your burn rate on a bond could be 5 to 10 years sometimes.
Yeah, we had originally programmed spending down all of this last bond within a 4-year period.
Okay.
Looks like it's going to be probably around 5 in reality for some of the projects. So the question is, do we do our next transportation bond in 2021 or 2022?
Gotcha.
It's up for discussion.
Cool.
So moving along, this is the list of new projects that have popped up since the original plan. Some of them were folded in when we did the update, and there's a few that have come up just because there's an ancillary project. It's in the capital budget, it's being built, and so we wanted to go ahead and just get it noted in the list. And so a good example of that is Jaguar Park Drive, which is at Athens Drive High School. It's going to link the Thomas Crowner Woodland Center and some of the stadium down near Athens Drive. Again, that wasn't something on our radar during the plan, but it is being built with capital funds, and we want to go ahead and just make sure that it's accounted for in the plan. I'll leave it up a minute so folks can look at it. But again, I can send the list to anybody that's interested.
So one thing we discussed in the pedestrian committee was how things get added to this list, and I made a plea, and I'd like to make it again today, that we figure out some way to work with shifting poverty and shifting of the location of support services to make sure that we know that they are choosing land and facilities that is cheaper, and increasingly that is in places that are not pedestrian friendly or bicycle friendly or sometimes even transit friendly. And so how can we be in cooperation with those groups and with the county Health and Human Services to at least make sure they're on our list, make sure it's on our radar. I went to Families Together this weekend for their kind of ribbon cutting, and it a wonderful organization doing wonderful work keeping families out of homelessness. And they were in a part of the city not far from here that doesn't have sidewalks or bike lanes or curb and gutter or paved roads.
Wow.
More and more folks are ending up in places like this because it's where the land is cheap. And
Just didn't even know that there were like not paved roads in the municipal.
yeah, Plainview, just out New Bern, just outside the Beltline. It's where there are a lot of hotels where you'll have people living in lieu of permanent housing. So, just making sure that these places are on our radar.
So do we have a way to capture that?
We don't. And this is a perennial problem. These agencies that are serving these populations locate in places that are adverse for their populations on occasion. And we are happy to work with them as it comes to siting.
Yeah.
And work with them, but the economics of it, sometimes it's
Yeah,
trying to find where the cheap land is. We understand
right.
and respect that completely.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's really disruptive for us to have to bend transit routes
Oh,
or
I'm sure.
do new unplanned infrastructure for a
Yeah.
problem that could have been prevented by adequate siting.
Right. Or I would say adequate funding.
Sure, and so that kind of, that's a whole different discussion for sure, but how can we be thinking strategically and not in silos and making sure that all of our departments are talking to each other as we have critical services or critical populations?
Yeah, not necessarily, understanding that it can be very disruptive. So not prescribing what the solution is, just advocating for an understanding of the problem, because it is going to get worse.
That's a good way to put it.
Yep, and remember, this is only one of many programs.
Oh, sure.
Which is a segue into the second part of this, the microgap program. So I think this is bullet number 3 or item number 3 under the new business. So we're halfway through the Paul Black Show here. We'll try to keep
We're
moving.
enjoying it so far, Paul, it's all good.
I should have brought my popcorn.
So the microgap is not specifically in the plan, but it was authorized in the budget by City Council, and that's kind of the authorizing legislation, if you will. I think the plan does sort of call for holistically dealing with things at the policy level, but there are not specific projects called out. So it's not a static list. That was our thinking when we kicked this off, but what we're finding is that more and more, a place where there might have been a 600-foot gap, 400 feet of it gets filled in by new development, and now I have a 200-foot piece that actually does qualify for the microgap program. We're seeing this pop up. On the other hand, occasionally a piece will get built by development, and I'm able to take it off the list. That's maybe not as common as I would like, but it does happen. The other piece is we sat down with a group of city departments to try to talk through how we can get things unstuck. And one piece that came out of it is we had been sort of somewhat under the radar for stormwater with this program. And part of that meeting was, that's a state law that's administered by the city and enforced by the city. And so with our standard sidewalk width, any sidewalk that's over about 35 feet is going to trigger that state requirement to get stormwater credits or do some kind of stormwater mitigation. That is going to make the program a little more difficult to implement, a little more costly, but again, it's not a showstopper, it's just now we have to step back and think about some things. So we did manage to find there are 4 that have been completed since the program's been developed. Patriot Ridge and Landshire View, I don't have anything tying them to a city action, so we assume that they were done by development. And then Jacqueline Lane, which actually has 3 separate microgaps along its length. One of them got built through the power easement, and then Frank Street, which was also built by the city. We also discovered 3 projects in the list that were not qualified, and we referred those to the petition program, which we're not going to talk about tonight. But it is the 3rd program that's out there. Remaining identified microgaps, 105. It's actually 106 as of today. Jason found one more for me. And they continue to come in. But we are working with the city units to try to complete 7 to 9 projects that fall underneath those stormwater requirements and to go ahead and have city forces try to get those done. We're continuing to follow up on that. They've actually been through a more rigorous design to try and see if there's anything, are there utility vaults, are there going to be vegetation issues or any kind of grading that's required. That may drop additional back out from that 7 to 9. Our hope is that they're all so small that we're not going to run into any of those issues, and we'll at least get some of these off the list. So stormwater, we're looking at a combination of buy downs or banking some kind of credit, or potentially bundling these with larger projects so that, say, when we do a New Hope Road widening, we say, can you go ahead and put this into the scope and ask your contractors that when they're out here pouring concrete for your project, they go by and they knock out 2 or 3 that are geographically close, and we account for them in the stormwater calculations as well. That's an ongoing discussion, but that's one of the ideas we're looking at. We're also researching any of the old plans to see if some of these sidewalks were actually permitted but never built. And maybe we took a fee in lieu or whatever the case might have been, in which case they're grandfathered and stormwater doesn't require us because it's already accounted for in the calculations for the development. And then the contracting environment continues to be a challenge. It's been a little bit easier with the slowdown at NCDOT, but I noticed the General Assembly found some more money for Secretary Trogdon last week, and maybe that's going to start to the slack will start to pick back up. But we are still looking at some of these things to try and get the program off the ground and moving again. We are still also working with the smaller contractors that Housing and Neighborhood has a list of folks that normally are subcontractors to larger contracts. But if we can keep the bonding requirements low, we may be able to have them come and do some of our work. And that's the end of 1, 2, and 3.
Could I ask a question about the
Yes.
the microgap? You said it was authorized by City Council. Was there funding appropriated with that?
Yes.
Okay, and there's currently how many on the list? A total of 100 and some?
106.
106, okay, thank you.
And again, just as a reminder, micro gaps are, we lovingly call them stupid spots. They're locations where the sidewalk runs are typically less than 300 feet. They're very short segments where there's clearly a sidewalk that starts and stops. In some cases, the gaps are as small as 30 feet. It may have been disrupted by utility contractor installation. In some cases, they were overlooked as part of a permitting stage. We're trying to find and identify as many of those as we can. But these are small projects that we're ideally supposed to be easy to knock out. We are finding in some cases that utilities and tree placement is making those a lot more difficult, and those have to be then handled through a normal project development standpoint.
How do you think the program is addressing the problem? Is it up to the task? Is it appropriately sized? Are you gaining on the number? Are you getting more to the list than we're knocking out every year? Is the problem just growing on us?
Right.
I think part of that's been the contracting environment. It's been we had the whole thing bundled and said, just go down the list until we run out of money, and we got crickets. So that was part of it. I think the other part has been that this seems like it should be easy, but what we find out when we go in there is some of these are really not easy. Some of them, they're where the creek crossing is, and so you're running into all kinds of constraints, and then you've got vegetation issues. Are we going to be taking out somebody's Bradford pear trees that are now 30 years old? Take them out. And maybe they'll be grateful, but maybe they won't be. And, we can't necessarily turn around and put like a 30-year-old, relatively mature tree for some of these suburban developments and put those back in. The utility stuff is just sort of all over. Do we have to move a pole? Can we get around the pole? We're looking for creative ways to try and solve the problem, but a lot of them turn out to sort of, when we get into the nitty-gritty details, they're not as simple to do as we would have thought. Some of them still are. Occasionally we find one that it doesn't need any grading, there's already curb and gutter, and we can go in and knock it out. And it's just a matter now of making sure we cover the stormwater piece. But what we're finding is those are not as much the rule as we had hoped.
Hey, Paul, can you mention what you told us about how development sometimes creates new micro gaps? I thought that was interesting.
That was, in fact, we had one over off, I think it was Watauga Street over near Oakwood. A new apartment complex townhouse development went in and replaced the old kind of duplex, quadruplex thing that had been there before. And as part of that, they brought their street frontage up to standard, and they built about 400 feet of sidewalk on a block that was 600 feet long. And so now we have a 200-foot micro gap where it used to be 600 feet long and would have been a petition program. So by shrinking the gap that's left, it was able to jump from one program into the other.
Right. So is there a way for us, as we're seeing development come online, to assess how they could fill? I mean, I know that plot, so that would have been, you would have to work with like a resident on the corner there to fill that micro gap in. So it wouldn't have been
there's one landowner and it's one lot.
Right. So in those types of instances, it's not feasible then to work with the developer to say, could they pay for that sidewalk to go in and just get the...
Do off-site improvements.
No?
I mean, unless required. It's,
Okay.
It's difficult.
Okay.
I mean, you could ask.
Sure. Because it seems like it would be lower cost to do it then too.
Yeah, well, they'd have a contractor and a truck.
The contractor, sure.
But
if the city paid for it and then the private developer built it.
Yeah, and we do have the money allocated by City Council in the budget, but we would have to have all the design and our stormwater stuff in place when the contractor was ready to go. And the coordination is more of a lift than it would sound. But could we make it work? I mean, theoretically, yes.
Because I guess where I'm trying to understand more is we do development site plan reviews as far as making sure they're in compliance with different, and that would only trigger in certain portions of, I don't think this was probably too residential of an application, I guess, or would we still provide review of like how Jason looks at making sure that they have certain things on spec in accordance with our guidelines.
Yeah, really, at this point, it would be if Jason caught it,
Uh-huh,
then we might have a chance to get in and do something.
okay.
I mean,
But again,
their
it is
building
a site-
completely code compliant. They're doing the entirety of their sidewalk
Oh, totally.
adjacent to
Yeah.
their development.
It would be more that opportunistically, if we could take advantage of their contractor being on site, and that's really the only sort of in that we would have.
Or just trying to think of like creative public-private partnerships as far as like we know that this land is being, if we know where our microgaps are and we know that there's being development done, or we know development will create a new microgap, like looking at a block basis.
Yeah, we do that on a frequent basis with development plans. If there's a situation where developer's developing X frontage and there's a small gap, we usually work with that developer to do an off-site improvement, and they're
Okay.
eligible for reimbursement for that. So
Okay.
we do that on a regular basis.
Okay,
Yep, so that's out there. Now, how big that is and
Sure.
how we make that work,
sure.
it's not as straightforward as it might be, but we'll make it work.
It sounds like y'all are doing a good job with the constraints that you currently have. It seems like you've thought through a lot of the things that,
Yeah, that's
I mean,
great.
so I'm happy with how this program seems to be moving forward.
And the bottom line from the implementation standpoint has to do with the contractor environment and the fact that
Right.
these are small contracts or
Right.
small projects, and the mobilization that's required to do each one. It's just, Wake County is so popular right now, and the capacity of the workforce to absorb small contracts, it's just,
Sure.
we're having a difficult time with that.
What about the, I understand that they use federal funding, so it might be complicated, but I'm assuming you guys have already talked to the folks that are doing Go Raleigh. Their little
Microgap
stubs
program.
of.
The pads.
They're making microgaps, but they're also like laying short runs of sidewalk.
Yeah,
There's
and
some
actually doing
contractor out there.
pads for a lot of their shelters. Yeah, and I've
so
actually
somebody's
been
out there doing concrete form work.
Yeah, I've been working with their staff to see if there's a way that, if nothing else, could we bundle,
Right.
Yeah.
some of their stuff with our stuff and maybe make a bigger,
More
catch
appealing
for
pot.
the contractor.
Groovy.
And there's nothing advantageous to bringing this in-house, is it, to having a construction crew that the city manages and implements?
It's mostly capacity, is my understanding, is again, they're stretched thin like all the other city departments.
Okay, just something to think about. If it's a hurdle we're consistently going to be facing, if we could train folks to stir concrete and.
Now, we are working with them to try and knock out the ones that are the 35 feet and under. We are actually going to go ahead and try and work with the city crews to try and make those happen.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts?
All right, last one of the night.
Let's do it.
All right. So I'm calling this the North-South Greenway Connector, formerly West Street, formerly Harrington Street potentially, depending on sort of what we hear back tonight. But we've developed a number of, number of alternatives to look at. So the current concept is a two-way cycle track that's bollard protected on the east side of Harrington Street. And that's what's pictured here. We started to do a list of sort of what are the pros and cons as we're doing an alternative analysis, not just of, Harrington Street, but really more about like what's the proper facility given all of the activities on the corridor and some of the traffic issues that we've got. We started out just saying a two-way cycle track, and we never really stepped back and said, is that the right facility? So we've done a number of different scenarios where we looked at things, and one is just, what if we made it parking protected too? What if we flip the parking? What happens? It does feel more protected to the bikes, but it does create some visibility issues because we do have a lot of turns and driveway cuts, especially where you've got high volume driveway cuts into parking garages. This could be problematic if it's not executed well. We looked at the NACTO guidance, and it did change since we first started this conversation around West Street, which was 3 years ago now. I know there was an open house when I was still at the Capillary MPO, so I know it's at least more than a year and a half. But one of the big changes was that to save parking on one side was one of the reasons you would do a two-way, and they've actually taken that out of the guidance. So these are all of the bullets. It's kind of text-heavy as a slide. But as I sat down with the two-way cycle track, I said, I really can't check any of these with a lot of confidence, and there's some that I flat out, it's not the right facility, the top one being on streets with few conflicts, such as driveways or cross streets on one side of the street. And we have lots of conflicts in driveways all over the place, and that was sort of one of the red flags to say maybe we should consider some other things. So looking at it, this would be the traditional one-way on each side, separated with bollards. The downside here is, yes, it would take all of the on-street parking and loading zones. We know that would probably be an issue for folks on the corridor. But we wanted to go ahead and say, as a starting point, this is something we looked at, and these are the pros and the cons. Well, what if we took it and we split it between 2 streets? And that spreads out that pain in terms of loading zones and parking so that no one street's going to lose all of it. This seems to work pretty well, and we really end up saving quite a bit of money at signals and at the railroad. And we also end up saving time in terms of implementation because we don't have those hoops to jump through. So if we are still looking for a sort of quick and easy install, we do really gain a lot by coming back to these one-way. And that works for both this one and the previous one. Again, it gets us out of those issues with the signals and with the railroad. And then we did the same thing, and we just flipped it, and we said, go northbound on one street and southbound on the other. This works well on Harrington Street, particularly up where Johnson Street now comes in as the off-ramp for Capitol Boulevard with a right slip lane. It does help us when we get up into the northern part of the corridor. Other than that, I think either one seems to be fine. And then we could even do this, but again, bring the parking over and make them parking protected. We'd still have the same visibility issue either way. But these are some of the alternative concepts that we're going to be rolling out. We do have an open house, so same pros and cons on that. One of the biggest things for us, I know that West Street, the BRT was one of the issues with the potential north-south BRT using West Street. By going down to one, there's still enough room to fit BRT and a bike lane and potentially at least a one-way for cars if BRT chose to go there. We can also thread the needle in the block around Jones Street where the tracks cross. On Harrington Street, we go down to about 36 feet in one area, and on West Street, we actually go down to about 31, and we can still thread that needle. But our next steps, we're going to present at the Oaks and Spokes Board tomorrow night. They're going to see this exact same presentation. We've got some individual stakeholder meetings going on. I know we've scheduled with Exploris Middle School to talk about their carpool line and sort of what these different proposals might do to their carpool issues. We're going to continue to set up some others with some of the merchants and some of the homeowner condo associations in the corridor. And all of that hopefully will happen before we do the big open house. That will be January 6th at the Dillon Building on the 9th floor in their lobby from 4 to 6. So go ahead and mark your calendars if you are interested. And we'll hear back. So in terms of the remaining timeline, I only went to there. Those are the only hard dates. Depending on what we hear at the open house, ideally, we want to be able to pick an alternative that we're going to take forward and do the full design for. And we'll bring that back for one final check from the community, shooting ideally for the spring if we pick an easy alternative. If we pick one that has a lot more design or signal work, it may take a little longer. If we find something that is relatively quick to do, we are hoping to do an implementation by the end of the building season when we can still lay down paint. That would get us into September of 2020. If we do something that is going to require a lot of work with the signals, it might actually push it out a year just to get all of that taken care of, all of the signal plans, and the additional cost and the actual installation of the signals would take some time.
Now, the corridor you're referring to is all the way from the Union Station on these two streets all the way up to Peace?
Ideally, yes.
Okay. So that
Can you pull up
doesn't.
a map too, maybe? Would that be helpful to look at a map?
I just want to make sure that was the entire corridor, because we'd had some places where it was broken up, and then at one
Right.
time we were talking about the railroad track
Right.
causing a barrier, but if we're talking all the way from Peace Street down to Union Station, I just want to make sure that that's
Yeah.
what we're discussing.
We want, first of all, I want to be very candid that we recognize that this is, again, a significant shift in strategy from what we originally had broached for the corridors. We started West Street looking at two-way cycle track. Because of design issues, we shifted to Harrington Street as a two-way cycle track. As we're looking at this, looking at the guidance from NACDO, recognizing that we're maybe trying to push a square peg into a round hole and stepping back, looking at the alternative that Paul's put forward in terms of looking at one-way bike facilities on both streets. One of the things that does is it makes the installation much more conventional. A bollarded, buffered bike lane fits very well into that footprint and replaces the on-street parking virtually one-to-one. But also, the key thing is there's no modifications to the traffic signals required in those scenarios, and there's no modifications required to the railroad crossings. So where we were looking at a first phase of implementation before being fairly limited within a few blocks, now suddenly we don't have that physical constraint. We can extend a lot more as part of our first phase of implementation.
really
Now,
exciting.
the one trade-off we'll have to work through is that there are a couple locations that we'll have to look at loading zones. And that is something that we may have to have some give and take on how we design loading zones and how often that could create an obstruction or not. But that's the one area we know is a significant conflict. And for a couple of the buildings, for example, like the Metropolitan, it was designed to have its loading zone in front of its service elevators on the east side of Harrington Street. So if we choose to do a bike lane on that section, we'll have to see if we can experiment with allowing that loading zone to coexist. This has been done in other cities. It's the type of thing that we'll have to try and see how that works. But those are the types of give and take that we'll have to work through.
Yeah, and part of the learning experience was actually the pop-up. I know working with the engineers, when we had, so it was on the east side of Harrington Street. So if somebody is southbound and they want to go west over to Union Station, when they go to turn right, they would be on the wrong side of the stop control to turn right out of the cycle track to go west. I don't know if you can picture that in your head, but if I'm headed southbound, when I go to make a right turn, the oncoming traffic is on the other side of the intersection over there. There's nothing that would alert a driver to say, hey, look for a stopped bike across the travel lane here. And we started working through, well, how would we do that? And it ended up being sort of a Copenhagen right as opposed to a Copenhagen left. So we'd take the bikes across the street, we'd have to put a stop box out in front of the stop bar, and then they would be on the wrong side of the street to proceed. So we'd have to have a two-way cycle track to receive them. If there's a one-way cycle track or just a regular bike lane, we couldn't get our heads around sort of how to make that work in terms of a waiting space for the bikes at the stops. So that was one of the things that sort of got us looking at, well, what are the alternatives? Because there are a lot of destinations on the corridor, and the bikes maybe don't want to go all the way through. They want to dump out at all points along the corridor. How do we accommodate that, and how do we do it safely? I'm sure we could figure it out. We have really smart engineers that work for us, but yeah, it would be a challenge, and it would be very awkward, and we'd have to do a lot of education to the cycling public.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, first of all, thank you so much, Paul, for presenting on this and continuing to move it forward. I know it's a testament to how many wrinkles there are in our downtown urban fabric when we initially thought West Street and then we thought Harrington Street, and it's been a really good learning experience, I think, for us because we know we need additional protective facilities for people to feel safe and to get out of their cars. So I'm excited about the ability to have a true corridor, which we did not have before. And that was giving, I think, folks heartburn because we want to be able to demonstrate success and we want to be able to show that when you do connect destinations, you do see people feeling comfortable and desiring to not always take the car for a trip. I think the things that come to mind with this, yes, loading zones are something we're, of course, going to have to be thinking about in the context of our urban environment, but also having to think about if it's a blocked bike lane, especially once they have bollards there to kind of, it might be real tricky for that cyclist and put them in a really susceptible and dangerous situation where they have to go out with very limited sight distance. And I have concerns about that. And let's continue those conversations and let's try to figure out a way that other communities have been doing these facilities for a very long time, and there are some best practices that have been identified, and I don't think parking in the bike lane is that best practice.
Yeah, I had this conversation when I was up in Toronto recently, and they had a situation where on one of their cycle tracks, they had a parking lane, area that was allowed to overlap for loading. And they're just now to the point of taking it out, but it's also to the point where they had over 200 conflicts per day. We don't have anything in Raleigh that approaches that level here, so that's good.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, let's just try not to be putting people in situations where they're all already vulnerable road users, and we don't want to make them more vulnerable. So let's try to limit those conflicts and talk about removing them completely when feasible.
I mean, good news, bad news. These new buildings all have dedicated loading docks. Multiple.
This may be just
Giant loading docks.
total aside, but do these plans include improvements to the railroad track crossings? Because they're pretty bad on those streets. I ride there a lot.
So if we're doing this would be just paint, okay? There are conversations about looking at improvements to railroad crossings across the city in general.
Yeah, I mean, I can name 10 now that could use some help, but especially if you're talking though about people who don't normally ride, there are big gaps in those two particular roads. It's just something to keep in mind. There may need to be some private fundraising or something to get, I don't even know if you can fix a railroad track not owned by the city, but
Some tactical.
I'm guessing
urbanism.
no by the laughter. Sorry, I'm new, but like
No.
it is actually an issue though for like
It's an issue for pets and wheelchairs and.
for sure. Yeah.
Or they're really bumpy.
Anything that's not in a car.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking like if
Yeah.
you're specifically encouraging people to ride on these roads in particular, those tracks are
Yeah,
Not
I ride
great.
across them too. They're-
yeah. Okay, so you feel me. But
Yeah, there are some that are worse, believe it or not. But again, if this is a high volume, it's something and again, that's where if we get a facility in and we get counters and we can demonstrate that the volumes are there, it sort of helps make a case that, okay, we do need to follow up. So hopefully it's a good problem to have, we hope, and one that's solvable. But I think in terms of alternatives, we're certainly going out to the public with a list of pros and cons. They could still come back and say, we still want the two-way cycle track, and we're happy to do that. But we want to make sure that we've thought it all through and everybody's okay with the trade-offs and making sure we've done a good job of listing those trade-offs. I don't have a full menu of that tonight. One of our engineers is working on what all the different parking impacts would be. That's one of the number one things out of the internal staff meeting is we need to have that number. So we can communicate that out. And then just maybe even just back of the napkin, sort of what do we think the different costs sort of ballpark would be? And maybe it's in a range. Maybe if we do this one, it's 50 to 75,000. If we do this other one, it's more like 200,000 or 300,000. We know as soon as we start touching signals, the cost is going to go up. And we know that, and we know about what that costs. So we're going to try and get that completely ready to go by the time we get to the open house so that when the community's having the discussions, they've got a well-informed set of pros and cons, and we can talk about those trade-offs and ideally come out of the open house with a clear direction.
In addition to timeline, identifying that as a trade-off as well. Can you make sure to include that as one of your
Yeah,
bullets?
timeline and the ability to do a corridor long versus a part of a corridor in phases.
Yeah, having been part of this conversation for about 4 years, I know that the biggest blockages for us not having this already installed was the traffic signal treatment on Edenton and Hillsborough Street, which are state DOT. And so this, I commend this plan because it removes those completely, which has been an impediment up to now. And always the railroad track crossing affected the decision one way or another, made it shorter or longer on our plan. So I commend these options and hope that we can overcome yet again and move forward, because this is something that a lot of people have been waiting for a long time.
Right. And I think my final thoughts on this are, if we are going to look, if the public provides feedback that they would like to do the West and Harrington alignment, I want it to be very intuitive, that there are, that this is, if we have extra funds that are not being, could we use it for directional signage to let people know, like, if this is our urban greenway? I would like to be talking about this as part of an urban greenway and connecting it to the greenway system. And this does very nicely segue into Devereaux Meadows. As you get further up north and we talk about investments toward Dix Park, it could connect really well into those facilities. And I want people to be thinking about it, as an extension of that system. And I want them to be thinking about it as something fundamentally different than what we've done to date. So if we're thinking about maybe painting the entire thing green, the entire corridor, something really fun, iconic, and that gets people excited that it's something different than what we've done before, and that y'all are listening to the feedback that's provided, and here we are, we're giving you something different. And I think that could be a really cool way to show that there's a receptiveness there. Do you have any thoughts? Okay. I'm so excited, you guys. I'm so excited. All right.
That's it for me.
Okay, cool. Board comments? We don't need any action from us, right, Paul? No. Okay.
I had one comment. I think it's about time for us to get back together with a cross committee with the Parks and Greenways. We've got two major greenways in our city, east and west, Crabtree Creek, that's had some major impediments, construction problems, and some deterioration over the past few years that have rendered a large section of it unusable for a long period of time.
Right.
And Walnut Creek Greenway, the southeast part of the city, between like the Wetlands Center and Wooddale Park area, Worthdale Park, seems to be deteriorating. And it would be good for us to get an update on some projects. I realize this is outside of the purview of Bike Ped, but bicyclists are using, as designed, these greenways as connectors and throughways, which we like as part of the city transportation grid.
Right.
And I think we've had some major issues in a number of areas. So I think if we could get a group from each commission together to go through some of the prioritization of projects, it would be helpful.
And I think if the commissioners should be aware that the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department is embarking on updating the Greenway Master Plan this year. And that's a fairly significant effort on their part, and to talking about projects and prioritization would fall very neatly into that.
Yeah, and I mean, there was an effort as well to make sure that there was a touch point with, last year, Susan and I, as the chair and vice chair, did meet with the Parks and Rec Board. We did receive some directive from council at the time, I think, to scale back those efforts. That was the interpretation I had of our work plan revision. So I think that I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I think that there is a need to think about those. Obviously, folks are using these systems as a network, and we need to be treating it as so. So I think that we need to kind of understand that conversation on a meta level as a council-led directive to our commission, and then understand how we can feed into the process with the Greenway Master Planning process, and understanding where those synergies can be met, because I think it's critical as well.
Do we have a seat on the advisory committee for that Greenway Master Plan? Have they?
We have two.
We have two. Okay.
So Susan and Dwight are the two individuals,
Great.
and we have received an email initially that was coordinating, but I don't think we've heard any follow-up since.
The council hadn't voted on it yet.
Okay, great.
So that should scale up soon.
Cool.
So if you have concerns, or if you're hearing feedback publicly with folks, please let Dwight and Susan know, and they can bring those concerns to that process. Any other board comments? Okay, I think I'm good. Announcements?
Can I make an announcement? So for those of you who don't know what cyclocross is, it is an extremely amazing bike race, and Oak City Cycling Project, and yours truly is the race director, is putting on a Christmas-themed cyclocross race on December 15th. You can find the information on Instagram, Facebook, or I will be happy to share it with you. Come out, it's going to be weird. There's going to be Santa Claus. It's going to be...
Is Santa Claus biking?
Probably, yeah. Probably. So if you're ever interested in seeing what the whole sport is about, it's a great fun way, kids races. It's really, should be fun. Juniors are racing for free thanks to another local club who's sponsoring it. So I'd like to just put that on everybody's radar. Come to Spring Hill, which is adjacent to Dix Park, and watch us get muddy.
Awesome.
I have one additional comment. This Saturday, Citric Cycle will be in the Christmas parade. We invite any
Who will be?
commissioner, Citric Cycle.
Oh.
So we invite members of the public as well as any commissioners that are available to join us in riding in the parade.
Wonderful.
And I will email information on how to sign up. It is also on social media with a sign-up link.
Cool, cool. I heard Santa's also in that, too.
You know, Santa's everywhere.
He's not on a bike, though, so, I mean, that would definitely be an amplification. All right, are we all done? Oh,
One other project-related announcement, like I said, things are slowing down, but there are some project meetings coming up. The one that we have on our radar is a 25% design public meeting for Barwell Road. That's an improvement project that's just on the north side of Rock Quarry. That meeting is December 19th at 6 p.m. at the Barwell Community Center.
thank you.
Don't
All
want to
right.
forget turkey trots.
Oh, yeah, don't forget it.
I understand, for living here for 20 years, holidays people leave Raleigh, and yet there's going to be over 10,000 people doing 6 different turkey trots in the area on
Dang.
Thanksgiving Day. So I guess if you don't leave, you run.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
the big ones are the Ridgewood Shopping Center turkey trot. That's the Raleigh Turkey Trot, Wade Avenue, Ridge Road. It's an 8K, 3,000 people, and there's a kids run. Then there's Gobbler's Run supporting Wake Forest Boys and Girls Club in downtown Wake Forest. It's at 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving morning. That's about 2,000 people, and I don't think they've ever counted the number of children. There's a lot of kids runs too. Trophy is doing the Trophy Trot 10K again this year. It's sponsored by Trophy Brewing over on Maywood, but they actually will be running in Dix Park. They start on Good Road in Dix Park, 8 o'clock as well. Wakefield High School has a Skinny Turkey Half Marathon, 10K and 5K, starting at 7:30 on Thanksgiving morning. And there's also runs in Cary at Inside Out Sports, and Apex Community Park is sponsoring a 5K as well. So just incredible amount of activities on Thanksgiving. So there's no excuse to not have some fun before the football starts.
There's an excuse. There's still that excuse.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, I think next meeting, thank you, will be held December 16th at 6 p.m. Put it on your
December
calendars.
what?
December 16th.
16, okay.
Thank you. All done. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Still gotta finish my beginning. What's that? All right. Still need to finish my beginning process.
How are you?
So Dwight, you're going to sit on the Greenway Master Plan?
Mr. Nick's got it going on. That committee, boy, I tell you.